A photograph that shifts every hour, yet never leaves the frame. Welcome to Detective Noir. I'm your host, Daniel Mercer. Tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing this community grow. Your comments mean the world to me. Let's dive in. It was one of those London mornings when the fog seems to think itself a citizen with rights, drifting in from the river and taking possession of the streets, the omnibuses, and even the parlours of respectable men. Holmes had been sawing at his violin, a brooding low strain that put me in mind of a tide beneath ice. The fire burned with a grudging flame, and I had the Times spread upon my knee, an old campaigner making feints at the foreign columns, yet always returning to the more domestic reports, when there came a rapping at our door, so impetuous that Mrs. Hudson, long schooled in emergencies, called up the stair to ask whether the police had discovered a new way of knocking. Holmes laid his violin aside and glanced at the clock on the mantel, a cheap French affair that he had once purchased to test a theory about resonance and a certain type of gas mantle. 9:30. "Come in," he said before my lips could form the invitation. The door swung wide to admit a tall gentleman whose coat had seen the inside of a cab, but not the brush of a valet this morning. He cast his hat upon the nearest chair and stood, breathing as if he had outstripped the fog by mere insistence. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" His voice was quick, as if pursued by something he could not outrun. Holmes bowed. "And Dr. Watson, pray warm yourself, sir. You have come from St. James's, I perceive, and there is ink upon your right cuff that is not your own. Sit, I beg you. Mrs. Hudson, the coffee, strong, if you please." The gentleman sank into the chair with an air of relief and surprise commingled. "You are quite right, St. James's, yes. The ink, belonging to a clerk who writes with a bassinet nib and keeps his pens in a flat tray rather than a stand," Holmes continued, with that air of lazy indifference which always precedes his most unsettling remarks. "The splash at your cuff is low and broad. Had it been your own pen, the mark would be higher and more pointed from the withdrawal. We shall suppose, therefore, a crowded desk, a man hasty to withdraw a document, and courtesy second to urgency. You did not quarrel with him. There is no smear. Hence a harried morning and a remarkable reason for it. Proceed." Our visitor lifted a hand, then let it fall. "My name is Sir Alistair Penrith. I am, as you have already surmised, from the Foreign Office." Holmes's eyelids lowered a fraction. The kettle began to whisper upon the hob. Sir Alistair continued, "I would not trouble you over a matter that seems on the face of it an absurdity, a parlour trick, an illusion, but it touches upon something I cannot, will not dismiss. I am to be married, Mr. Holmes, in 3 weeks' time. The lady is Miss Clara Harbury, of Eaton Place, daughter of the late Colonel Harbury of the Bengal Staff Corps. There has been nothing," he gestured helplessly, "nothing irregular until 3 nights ago, when a photograph began to—" He faltered, as though the word itself might crack in the uttering. "To change," Holmes stirred, but said nothing. I set down my paper. "A photograph, Sir Alistair," I said. "You mean that a portrait altered itself?" "Not once, Doctor. Hourly." There was a minute during which the fire seemed the only sound in Baker Street. Outside a dray rumbled, and the fog pressed its fingers to the panes. Holmes reached for the poker, tapped it twice upon the hearthstone, and replaced it. "Describe the circumstance," he said. It was a cabinet card of Miss Harbury, one of those formal studio pieces we all possess. You understand that she is of a serious temper, reserved, not given to jests. I keep the likeness on the mantel of my drawing-room in Bentinck Street. 3 nights ago I returned late from Whitehall. The gas was low. I increased it. The photograph, which I have had these 6 months, presented an aspect I had not seen before. Miss Harbury's brooch, an oval of jet, was not at her throat. I recalled it distinctly. She wears it in memory of her father. I thought the light misled me. At 11, when I prepared to retire, I looked again. The brooch had reappeared, Holmes's fingers steepled. "And you are certain we speak of the same print, not a second likeness placed in its stead?" Sir Alistair allowed himself a wan smile. "You must forgive me, Mr. Holmes, I am not a fanciful man." I took the card in my hand. It was the same. The corners were softened by handling. There is a faint crease at the upper right. The photographer's stamp, Silas Vetch of Holborn, shows a blot upon the V, all identical. And yet, at midnight, I looked once more. The brooch was there, but the chain about Miss Harbury's neck had shifted. No, not shifted, it lay differently, as if— He groped for words. As if the moment had breathed and then altered its mind. You kept vigil, I did. At 1 in the morning, the jet brooch was gone again, the chain slightly lower. At 2, the background curtain had drawn a trifle. A fold that had not been present was there. At 3, the slightest hint of shadow on her left cheek. Each hour, some minute revision, like the ticking of a clock in silk. Yesterday evening, the changes were coarser. At 9, a carnation that had been in her hand was no longer there. At 10, her gaze, Holmes, I swear it, her gaze looked not at the camera but a hair's breadth to the right. Mrs. Hudson arrived with the tray. Sir Alistair took the cup with both hands, as one might take communion, and steadied himself. You told no one? Holmes asked. I told my valet Hobbs this morning. He has the imagination of a turnip and the loyalty of a mastiff. He laughed until I bade him look. He looked, and then he did not laugh. He said I must be deceived by gaslight. We turned it down, then up, then extinguished it altogether and raised the blind to the pallid morning. The photograph remained as it had been at 7. The carnation again present, the brooch restored. When I left for Whitehall, I placed the card in a drawer in my study and locked it. And yet you have come here in haste, Holmes observed, because a locked drawer did not suffice. Sir Alistair closed his eyes, as though to shut out the memory. At 9 o'clock, as the first clerks were lighting their stoves, a boy arrived at my office with a note. No address upon the outside. Within, a single sentence in an unfamiliar hand. You cannot lock away what changes with the hour. There was also, he dipped his hand into his inner pocket and produced a small square wrapped in tissue. The negative. Holmes took it with a quickness that betrayed interest at last. An albumen negative upon glass? He asked. A dry plate, I'm told. Vetch uses them now. The boy said it had been left at my door by a gentleman with a muffler and a limp. Holmes's eyes, which had seemed indifferent, quickened like embers revived. A limp, left or right? The boy believed the left, and the muffler, foreign weave. The note is on English wove. The hand is. Holmes held the scrap up to the light, curiously regular, as if the habit of writing were constrained by frequent copying. Watson, the magnifier. I passed him the lens. He did not look through it at once, but turned to Sir Alistair, as a hawk turns to a rustle in the grasses. Pray tell me, Sir Alistair, of Miss Harbury's circle, her intimates, her servants, and whether any gentleman has found his attentions discouraged there. Sir Alistair's jaw tightened. Miss Harbury is well liked by her aunt, Mrs. Trevelyan, with whom she resides. There is a cousin, Mr. Edwin Trevelyan, a young man of talent and uncertain means. A companion, Miss Ada Lenfield, resides in the house. As for a suitor, there was one, Captain Roland St. John, late of the King's Own. He pressed his case last year. Miss Harbury declined him. He is persistent. Holmes nodded as though at a fact he had himself just deduced. And the photographer, Mr. Silas Vetch of Holborn, why did you choose him? Miss Harbury's aunt recommended him. He has a reputation for technical novelties. He boasts that he can fix an expression that the sitter never showed. A most alarming claim, said Holmes softly. And this valet of yours, Hobbs, how long in your service? How long in... 12 years, dependable. Utterly. Holmes took the dry plate from its tissue and held it to the window's pale light. The fog received it with jealous care. He moved it slightly, then still more slightly as if to coax a whisper from it. Watson, he said at last, the edges of the plate show filing where they ought not. Note here and here. A gentleman with a limp left a plate with message attached. A cabinet card behaves like a barometer of the hour. A photographer brags he can cement moods as a man cements tiles. Sir Alistair, you have done well to come. You will take the case. Holmes's mouth curved at one corner. I will at least take my hat. If photographs in London are now subject to the tides, we must learn who commands the moon. You will return home at once, Sir Alistair. Touch nothing. Allow no one to meddle with the frame, the mantle, or the gas bracket above it. If your valet offers to dust, forbid him that piety. We shall follow. Sir Alistair rose, the crushed expression on his features easing at last, though the fog at the window made a grey morning out of the day. He thanked us, and in a moment his cab wheels were already swallowed by the street's breath. Holmes stood very still. The violin on its chair looked like a folded wing. He reached for his Inverness, then paused to pinch a trace of soot from the grate and rub it between finger and thumb. Do you know, Watson, said he, there are only 3 ways a photograph may change under a man's nose: the light that shows it, the surface that bears it, or the eye that reads it. Since our client is neither blind nor drunk, and the gas bracket above his mantle is set at a queer angle, no accident that, we shall inquire first into the second. Bring your stethoscope. I do not know if we shall need it for Sir Alistair's heart or Mr. Silas Vetch's conscience. You suspect the photographer? I suspect Kraft. Whether it belongs to a tradesman or a rival suitor, a cousin with debts or a gentleman with a limp who keeps the hours better than a clock, we shall see. London, my dear fellow, is a gallery of moving pictures. The trick is to find the hand that changes them, and with that he took up his cane. The fog met us at the door like an accomplice. The cab bore us westward, the fog slipping its pale fingers through the seams and making the lamps into moons. Holmes sat with his chin upon his breast and the glass plate cradled in his gloved hand, as though it were a living thing he meant not to startle. I have come to recognize that attitude as one of coiled activity. The muscles rest, the mind ranges. Once he lifted the plate to the cab window and allowed the meagre day to thread it. He did not speak until we turned into Bentinck Street. Sir Alistair's house presented that quiet propriety which declares a life more regulated than happy. A maid admitted us. The air within smelt faintly of beeswax and a previous evening's gas. We were conducted not to the drawing-room, where the photograph had held audience, but first to the study where our client had locked it. There was the drawer, the lock honest and not disturbed. Sir Alistair himself stood by it with a key upon a ribbon. He looked older by an hour, as men do who have been obliged to invent a second self to manage their fear. Without preamble, he opened the drawer and drew forth the cabinet card, wrapped in a sheet of foolscap. Holmes took it and held it at arm's length, then nearer, then sideways to let the light run across its varnished surface. It was a sweet and formal likeness of a young lady, whose gravity did not extinguish a certain inward warmth. The jet brooch shone at her throat, the carnation lay upon her hand. The chain rested rather higher than I recalled from Sir Alistair's account, though I could not swear to it. Holmes made no sound. He passed the card to me, then stepped to the mantel with an abruptness that caused our client to start, and examined the bracket above. "You will oblige me, Sir Alistair, by allowing the lowest light that will keep the chill at bay," said he. "Watson, stand here, now a foot to the right, and tell me what you see as I vary the flame." He took the lever of the gas bracket between finger and thumb and, with a delicacy that would have become a jeweller, altered it a degree this way and that. The photograph, now set again upon the mantel in its simple frame, suffered the play as a face suffers weather. Under the lesser flame the carnation's petals blanched, under the higher they deepened. There was, too, a minute sliding of shadow beneath the chain, a whisper of gloom in the fall of the drapery behind Miss Harbury's shoulder, such trifles as one might impute to the change of light until one saw them join hands like conspirators. Holmes's gaze left the image to explore the metal of the bracket. It had been set, as I had noticed in his rooms, he had remarked, at a curious cant. The screws were not original. One bore a faint burr as though a screwdriver had slipped. He stooped until his cheek was almost against the wall, drew a small pocket lens from his waistcoat, and inspected the plaster. When he straightened, he glanced at the cornice directly above the mantel, then at the carpet beneath. He snapped his fingers. Soot. See the delicate crescent? Watson, like the print of a fingernail in lamp-black, just where a man's shoulder would brush if he leaned to adjust the bracket from a ladder no higher than a chair. And observe here, a pinhead of oil, transparent yet not dried upon the joint. Harris's oil, I think. Cheap and unperfumed. Your valet does not oil your gas, Sir Alistair. Hobbs? Never. Then a visitor did so, one less fond of squeaks than of their absence. Pray, when was your last evening alone in this room? I was out until near 9. Hobbs sat up for me, and earlier, my aunt dined with us, Mrs. Trevelyan and Miss Harbury. We took tea here before they left at 6. Were they alone in this room at any time? Sir Alistair considered and shook his head. The maid came and went. I fetched a brandy. I was absent for a minute only. Holmes had his nose now against the frame of the photograph. He breathed once, a small inward sound of satisfaction, and with his nail touched the backboard where the card lay. The frame was of the common sort with a hinged clasp. He took out his penknife, not the blade, but the thin file that is set within it, and inserted the point beneath the brown paper that sealed the back. He lifted a 1/4 inch and laid it down again as a physician lifts a dressing. He did not break it fully. "A new seal upon old paper," he murmured, to no one in particular. "The paper has been laid twice. It gapes at the corner like a mouth that has learned to speak. Sir Alistair, did you ever remove the card from its frame?" "Never." Holmes replaced the photograph upon the mantel with the same tender care he had shown the glass plate. He turned without warning to the bell pull and drew it. When Hobbs appeared, a neat, compact man with the placidity of a good cattle dog, Holmes greeted him as an old acquaintance. "Mr. Hobbs," said he, "you have been in Sir Alistair's service 12 years. In that time he has taught you the virtues of punctuality, loyalty, and the avoidance of gas leaks. You will oblige me with answers that are exact. Who cleans this mantelpiece?" "I do, sir, twice a week. Bessie does the dusting on the odd day." "When did you last dust it?" "Yesterday afternoon, sir, before the ladies came." "Did you observe any gentleman upon a chair at the mantel, or hear a squeak of metal, or smell oil?" "No, sir, only," he hesitated, "the bracket has stuck of late." "I meant to mention it. And did you see this frame out of its place?" "No, sir. It sits there, except when Sir Alistair takes it up." Holmes dismissed him with thanks and a coin that, for reasons of his own, he always furnishes as if he had been paid for receiving answers. When the door closed, he went to the window and peered down. As if the fog could be compelled to confess, "There are 3 elements, Watson," he said softly, repeating himself as a man might test the strength of a rope: light, surface, and eye. Here we have a manipulated light, evidenced by recent adjustment and oil, a surface meddled with, evidenced by a second sealing, and an eye instructed to expect change by the impertinent note. It is no haunting, Sir Alistair. It is a design. The question is whether the author of the design sits at a Holborn camera, presses a captain's sleeve, or sings treble in a drawing room. You mean to see the photographer? Presently. But first I would borrow an hour. You will forgive us if we impose our company upon your lunch. At the stroke of noon, if your phenomenon is punctual, we shall be here to observe it. And until then I shall remove nothing, touch nothing, and learn what a man may from a room that believes itself unobserved. Holmes's manner, when he is in his element, becomes at once homely and august. He wandered now as if idle, noting the thin ash in the grate, the faint impress of a damp glass upon a side table, a smear upon the brass of the door where a left-handed man has closed it with his thumb. He knelt once, abruptly, to extract from under the skirting a sliver of something that might have been straw, and might have been the strip of paper that protects a photographic plate. He smelt it, frowned, and slid it into his pocketbook. The hour, when it came, did so with the ceremony of London clocks gathering themselves to speak. We stood by the mantel as the bells set their silver lids trembling. Sir Alistair's face had tightened. Even I, against my own better judgment, felt a childish anticipation. Holmes looked not at the photograph, but at the wall a hand's breadth to the right of it. When the last chime fell, he flicked the gas lever 2 degrees and said, "Now I looked, and though I had steeled myself, I could not deny that a new shadow had crept into the folds of the curtain, that the carnation stem, which I could have sworn lay straight, made now the faintest of curves, that Miss Harbury's eyes, no, I would not swear it, seemed fractionally to acknowledge some presence beyond the frame. You see it, Holmes?" I whispered. "I see that a varnish takes a light and gives it back otherwise," he returned, "and I see that the hand which contrived this desired that no man should be quite certain without a specialist to sell him certainty. Come, Watson, we have enough to justify the next call. Sir Alistair, you will do precisely as before. Touch nothing. Admit no one who cannot name to you the colour of the boy's muffler who brought the plate this morning." "What colour was it?" our client asked, stung to practicality. Holmes was already at the door. "Mouse brown," he said over his shoulder, and the limp was honest. "It is the man behind him whose gait does not match his trade. Let us go to Mr. Silas Vetch of Holborn and hear his boastings at the source." Holborn received us with its customary din, carts and carriages jostling, a chorus of barrows and the sharp cry of a newsboy cutting through the fog's throat. Holmes threaded the pavement like a greyhound upon a scent, his lean figure refusing to yield to the crowd. I followed in his wake, my shoulder brushed by tradesmen and clerks, until we reached a narrow shopfront bearing in faded gilt, "Silas Vetch, Portraiture and Artistic Studies." A curtain of dull green hung behind the plate glass, and a faint odour of collodion leaked into the street. Holmes pushed the door, and we stepped into a dim interior lined with photographs, solemn men in stiff collars, families arranged with the symmetry of chessmen, and here and there the flutter of a child's frock caught mid-laughter. The air was chemical and close. Behind a counter, a man of singular aspect emerged. Tall, with a skull too long for elegance and eyes that darted like fish in shallow water. His mouth was broad, and when he smiled, the impression was of someone testing the strength of the smile before using it in earnest. "Mr. Vetch?" Holmes asked without offering a card. "The same, sir." "And you are—" "A humble seeker after truth," Holmes returned, his glance raking the room. "My friend and I have an interest in your technical innovations. You claim to fix an expression that the sitter never showed." "A bold assertion, not bold, sir, scientific." Vetch's hand lingered upon a stack of cabinet cards as if they were chips in a gambling den. "The camera may be honest, but it is not the whole truth. The eye sees more than the lens. I merely supply the difference." Holmes's brows rose. "You admit then to alteration?" "I admit to art. The public desires not reality, but the impression of it. A man may never smile as he wishes his grandchildren to think he smiled. A lady may not wish a frown perpetuated. I offer them what memory demands, not what light records." Holmes bent over a framed display where a young woman, prim in one photograph, reappeared in another with the faintest hint of gaiety about the lips. A third likeness, unmistakably of the same sitting, showed her eyes almost roguish. Holmes tapped the glass with his forefinger. "Extraordinary. And this metamorphosis is achieved upon the same negative, upon it and beyond it. I will not weary you with the particulars, sir, but suffice it that a steady hand, certain varnishes, and a respect for light can work wonders. Some call it deceit. I call it completion." Holmes's face betrayed nothing. "And yet your art could in unscrupulous hands become a weapon." Vetch's smile hardened. "Any tool may be turned. I sell portraits, not conspiracies." Holmes drifted towards the counter, where a tray of glass plates lay ready for sealing. He lifted one, his fingers encased in gloves, and turned it delicately toward the light. Curious, filing upon the edge, he murmured, "A habit of yours? Sometimes the plates do not fit the carriers. A touch of the file corrects it, even at the risk of weakening the seal." Vetch's eyes narrowed. "You speak as one who knows the craft." "I have looked through many lenses," Holmes replied carelessly. "Tell me, did you take a portrait of Miss Clara Harbury of Eaton Place?" Vetch's composure wavered the breadth of a breath. "If I did, it was in confidence." Holmes smiled faintly. "Confidence is well repaid by confidence. Let us say that a gentleman, perhaps a suitor, desires to keep her likeness by his bed. Would you oblige him with variations? A brooch gone here, a carnation absent there, an altered cast of eye?" Vetch's fingers tightened upon the cards. "That would be grotesque, sir. I do not make phantoms." Holmes set down the plate. "Nor do I. Yet a phantom has been made, and it wears Miss Harbury's face. Consider me a physician, Mr. Vetch. When a patient's malady is born of another man's art, I must know the instruments used, else the cure is impossible." The photographer drew himself upright, and for a moment the room shrank about him. "I have clients of name and station. If you suggest impropriety—" "I suggest nothing," Holmes interrupted smoothly. "I only observe." He tapped the tray. "Filing here, varnish there, an ambition to capture what the sitter did not give. And perhaps a hand unsteady with malice rather than with art. Tell me, who else has the skill to tamper with a sealed frame once it leaves your care?" "No one, unless," Vetch hesitated, "unless another who has studied here. I have apprentices, some cleverer than prudent." "Names," Holmes said softly. "There was one, Roland St. John, a soldier by commission, but restless. He lingered about the darkroom more than he paid his fees. He thought photography a path to fortune. I dismissed him last winter." Holmes's eyes glittered. "And where might we find this restless soldier?" Vetch shook his head. "He spoke once of lodgings near Kensington, but he is a drifter." "If mischief has been wrought, sir, it is not mine." Holmes inclined his head as if granting an appeal. He slipped a coin upon the counter, not for service but as an experiment, and we withdrew into the fog. Once clear of the shop, he strode on without looking back, his gaze abstracted, his lips compressed. At last he spoke. "The photographer is an artisan and a braggart. He toys with shadows but not with plots. Yet he has given us the name we required. Captain Roland St. John, discarded suitor, dismissed apprentice, restless spirit with skill enough to fashion deception. It fits too snugly, Watson." Thy suit cut so neatly may be made for another man. And Sir Alistair, he has enemies enough. A cousin with debts, a companion with secrets, a valet too loyal for subtlety, but the captain bears watching. We shall call at Kensington before the day dies. The fog thickened as we turned toward the cab rank, and Holmes's face, half lost in the vapour, seemed to wear the same inward vigilance I had seen in the photograph, eyes watching something beyond the frame. Holmes had the cab rattle us westward through streets that dwindled into quieter crescents, the fog growing denser, as though it too conspired to hide our quarry. He sat back with his fingers drumming against the handle of his cane, his eyes half closed, though I knew every sense was alert. At last he leaned forward and rapped the roof. We disembarked at a terrace of shabby lodging-houses, their brickwork begrimed, the curtains either drawn at midday or not present at all. Holmes consulted a scrap of paper upon which he had scribbled an address wrested from Vetch's reluctant tongue, then led me up a narrow flight of steps to a door, whose knocker bore a faint dent, as if struck too often and too hard. A stout landlady answered, her apron grey with flour. Holmes addressed her with the politeness he reserves for those whose tongues he hopes to loosen. "Captain Roland St. John, does he lodge here?" She pursed her lips. "He has the upper rooms, sir, though he keeps ours unfit for Christians. Came in late last night, near dawn it was, limping like he'd marched from Calais. Paid his rent, though, in good sovereigns. Not much more I can tell you." Holmes gave her a coin which made her inclination warmer. "Would you permit us a look at his staircase?" he asked. She agreed, and we ascended the creaking flight. At the landing, Holmes knelt at once, peering with his lens at the worn boards. He touched a dark smudge with his finger, lifted it to his nose and nodded. "Cheap oil again," he murmured. "The same that kissed the gas bracket. Our captain carries his tricks with him." The door to St. John's chamber stood unlocked. Holmes pushed it open without ceremony. The room was close, the bed unmade, a trunk half open with shirts thrust in disorder. Upon the table lay a scattering of photographic paraphernalia, scraps of paper, a pair of scissors, a file whose teeth were clogged with glass, and 2 empty varnish bottles. Beside these, like an afterthought, lay a folded muffler of mouse-brown wool. Holmes lifted it delicately. "The messenger's livery, Watson. We need no boy's testimony now." I looked about and felt a chill that the fireless grate could not account for. Upon the mantel stood a small frame, cheap and gilt. Within it, a woman's likeness, Miss Harbury again, though the likeness was coarser, the background blurred as if copied from the original. Here the carnation was missing. Here her gaze was sly, unsettling. I could not escape the sense that a human expression had been twisted into something it had never meant to show. Holmes examined it without surprise. Proof enough that St. John practices more than portraiture. He turned the frame, and as before, the paper backing bore signs of tampering. He replaced it carefully. Then, with a swift glance round the room, he crossed to the trunk. Clothing, a half-empty bottle of brandy, a military sash, nothing more. Yet as he stooped, he drew from beneath the trunk a small packet bound with string. He slit it open with his knife and revealed a stack of negatives, each bearing the unmistakable features of Clara Harbury. "Some plain, some altered," said Holmes grimly. "Observe, here the chain vanishes, here the eyes wander. The man has practiced upon her likeness as a gambler practices with cards. And this, Watson." He drew one plate apart. The image showed Miss Harbury with her head turned slightly away, an aspect never achieved in the sitting described to us. Such a plate is not chance. It is intent. At that instant, footsteps sounded upon the stair. Holmes's hand shot up for silence. The tread was heavy, uneven, the limp of which we had heard. He moved to the door, threw it wide, and there upon the landing stood a tall, gaunt man in a greatcoat, his face haggard, the eyes red-rimmed. Fair soldier's carriage clung to him still, though marred by bitterness. He halted, his gaze sweeping past Holmes to me, then to the table with its betraying litter. "Who the devil are you?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. Holmes's reply was calm. "A fellow student of Light and Shadow. You are Captain Roland St. John, late of the King's Own, latterly of Mr. Vetch's darkroom. We have been admiring your handiwork." St. John's eyes flickered to the negatives Holmes held. His expression hardened. "Return those, sir, unless you desire trouble." "Trouble is already yours," Holmes answered. When a man torments a lady's image to unsettle her betrothed, he declares war upon decency itself. The police will call this forgery. I call it villainy of a more insidious stripe. St. John gave a bitter laugh. Police? They would sooner shake my hand than hers. Do you know what it is to be cast aside, Mr. Holmes? To serve your country, to come home with a limp and nothing but shadows for company, and then be told by a lady, by Clara, that her heart belongs elsewhere. She might have worn my name, but she chose that smooth-faced Penrith. Well, let him see her as I have made her. Let him watch her face turn hour by hour, until he doubts her fidelity, her sanity, until he doubts everything. He stepped forward, his hand upon the table, and in that gesture, I saw the desperation of a man clinging to the only power left him. Holmes did not move, save to slide the packet of negatives into his pocket. You have talent, Captain, Holmes said quietly, but you lack discipline. You have turned your skill from solace to cruelty. You will answer for it. Watson, do not block the way. He has nowhere to run. St. John's breath came ragged, and for an instant I thought he might spring upon us. Instead, he staggered to the bed, dropped upon it, and buried his face in his hands. The fight seemed to drain out of him as brandy drains from a glass. His shoulders shook once, then stilled. Holmes watched with an expression I could not read. At last he spoke, low enough that only I heard. He is beaten for the moment, but despair makes a man dangerous. We must tread warily. Penrith must hear of this, yet not from us alone. Lestrade will do for the net, but the threads we must gather ourselves. He touched my arm, and we left the captain slumped in his room, the muffler and the mutilated photographs standing silent witness. Outside, the fog clung thicker, and Holmes drew his coat tight about him. The game moves quickly now, Watson, he said. One enemy is revealed, yet the hand that set him in motion may still be hidden. We must not mistake the pawn for the player. We walked in silence until the cab carried us once more into clearer air. Holmes remained with his chin thrust forward, his brows knitted, and I could feel the weight of his concentration pressing upon the air between us. At last he spoke, not to me, but into the fog that trailed behind the glass. St. John is a craftsman of shadows, he said, a dangerous man when pride and rejection sharpen the tool. Yet what troubles me, Watson, is that his malice is crude compared with the elegance of the trick at Penrith's mantle. Those negatives would serve for crude alterations, yes, but the timed effect, the hour-by-hour deceit, that required calculation and engineering. That was no drunken soldier's fancy. You suspect another hand. Holmes gave me one of those swift glances in which 100 thoughts compress themselves. Every crime of cunning has its seam. A man of passion supplies the motive, but a man of calculation supplies the means. The two are seldom the same. When we returned to Baker Street, the fog clinging to our coats as if it meant to lodge with us, Holmes wasted no time. He spread the packet of negatives upon the table, careful to shield the flame of the lamp lest it scorch them, and examined each in turn. Some bore rough scraping, others smudges where the varnish had been tampered with. He set aside those most obviously altered, then produced a thin magnifier and studied the edges. Note the filing, Watson. These plates have been tampered with by a hand more practiced than St. John's. His limp betrays him. He works with haste and bitterness. But here, see how the filing is clean, precise, measured. This is a technician's touch. Someone supplied him with prepared material. Someone who understood how to coax light into lies, Vetch, I suggested. Holmes shook his head. Vetch is vain enough to boast, but too jealous of his reputation to risk his trade in conspiracy. No, another. Consider who might stand to benefit most from Penrith's torment. The cousin, Edwin Trevelyan, I ventured. You recall Sir Alistair mentioned his uncertain means. Holmes permitted himself the faintest smile. Excellent, Watson. A cousin with debts, a young man of talent and likely no scruple in turning skill to profit. If he could contrive to shake Penrith's confidence before the marriage, he might hope to inherit, or at least delay the union to his advantage. And to do so by enlisting a discarded suitor would be a stroke of cleverness. He paced the room, his dressing gown flaring with each stride. At last he stopped and struck the mantel with the flat of his hand. Tonight, Watson, we must see this photograph change again, under my eye and with my instruments. Then, if my suspicion proves correct, we shall set a snare not for the captain, but for the mind behind him. By the time we reached Penrith's house once more, the gas lamps had begun their nightly duty, casting circles of yellow through the grey. Sir Alistair admitted us himself, his expression tense with the strain of waiting. "I have obeyed you in all things," he said at once. The photograph remains upon the mantel untouched. "But Holmes, I beg you, what am I to believe? Clara is innocent, yet the very image of her conspires to shake my trust." Holmes laid a hand upon his arm with unexpected gentleness. "Believe only that malice walks in your shadow, Sir Alistair, and that it is our task to strip its disguise." We ascended to the drawing-room. Holmes took from his pocket a small case containing a dark lantern, a measuring rod, and a vial of powdered chalk. He arranged them with the solemnity of a surgeon preparing for the theatre. I, too, felt the weight of the moment. The photograph stood there as before, its young subject serene, yet I could not shake the memory of her altered gaze in St. John's chamber. Holmes dimmed the gas to the precise angle he had observed earlier. Then he opened the lantern, allowing a narrow beam to fall upon the frame. With the chalk he dusted the air just above it, as though seeking the invisible hand that toyed with the light. We waited. The house was so still that I heard the clock in the hall strike each quarter. At the stroke of 11, a subtle shiver passed through the room. I blinked, and when I looked again, the brooch at Clara's throat seemed absent. Sir Alistair uttered a strangled sound, half anger, half despair. Holmes bent at once, holding the beam steady. "There, see it, Watson. Not the photograph, but the varnish. A second film laid upon the surface, so fine the eye cannot detect it. Under altered gas, the film yields one image, under natural light another. Ingenious, but no phantom. And the workmanship. It is of an artist who understands chemistry as well as resentment." "Trevelyan," I breathed. Holmes straightened. The beam still fixed. "Precisely. St. John supplied the passion, Trevelyan the mechanism. Together they brewed this torment. But proof, Watson, proof is still required. Tonight we must let the snare close. Let the snare close. Sir Alistair, still pale, clutched the back of a chair. "What must I do?" "Only this," Holmes said softly. "Pretend to despair. Write to your cousin Trevelyan this very night, confessing your doubts of Clara, hinting that you mean to break the engagement unless you can be reassured. Invite him here tomorrow, to counsel you as a kinsman. Then leave the rest to me, and if he refuses—" Holmes smiled with that cold satisfaction, which meant the endgame was near. "He will not. For a man who lives by others' ruin cannot resist the scent of victory." We departed soon after midnight, leaving Penrith to his task. As we walked back into the chill streets, Holmes's step was brisk, his energy renewed. "The pieces are placed, Watson. Tomorrow the curtain rises, and we shall see whose hand directs the play." He drew his cloak tighter against the fog and muttered, half to himself, half to me. "A photograph does not change of its own accord. Men do, and therein lies the real picture." The following afternoon found us once more at Bentinck Street. The fog had thinned into a pale gauze, through which the lamps glowed like lanterns half forgotten after a fete. Sir Alistair received us with the nervous stiffness of a man who has played his part upon Holmes's instructions, yet doubts the stage will hold. He pressed into Holmes's hand a copy of the note he had written to Edwin Trevelyan the previous night. Its tone, I thought, was admirably contrived, expressing anguish at the strange alterations in Clara's likeness, hinting that his confidence in her faltered, and imploring his cousin's counsel. Trevelyan had replied with alacrity, promising to call that very evening. Holmes read both notes without a word, folded them, and placed them in his pocketbook. He glanced about the drawing-room, noting every object as though he had never seen it before, then instructed that all servants remain below stairs. He extinguished one of the gas jets, leaving the room dim but not unwelcoming, and drew our chairs to a corner where we might command a full view of the mantel without ourselves being in shadow. Then we waited. The clock struck 7 when Edwin Trevelyan was announced. I had expected a nervous, shifty youth. Instead, a tall young man entered with the confidence of one accustomed to his own reflection. He was of slight frame, but his manner suggested energy suppressed rather than absent. He greeted Sir Alistair warmly, and when his cousin introduced us merely as acquaintances, his quick glance swept over us without suspicion. "My dear Alistair," he said, "I came at once upon reading your letter. What is this nonsense of doubts and photographs? Clara is above reproach. If you question her, you wound yourself as well as her." Holmes, silent in the corner, let the words hang like smoke. Sir Alistair, as rehearsed, shook his head with convincing gloom. I have seen things, Edwin, things no man should see in the likeness of the woman he loves. Her portrait alters hour by hour. You may say it is folly, yet I have seen it with my own eyes. Trevelyan gave a low laugh, smooth as silk. Alterations? My dear cousin, you have overworked yourself at Whitehall. Such fancies come to men in strain. A portrait is no living creature. And yet, Sir Alistair pressed, the changes are undeniable. The brooch, the carnation, even her gaze, each shifting. Am I to wed a lady whose very likeness betrays her? Trevelyan leaned forward, his hand upon Alistair's arm. You must not speak so. Clara is constant. I will show you, if you wish, how imagination can play tricks. Let us examine the portrait together. Holmes stirred slightly, though he did not rise. The bait had taken. Sir Alistair led his cousin to the mantel. The photograph sat there, its surface catching the uncertain gaslight. Trevelyan bent over it, and I saw his lips tighten, though he quickly composed himself. He spoke lightly, almost with mockery. There, look closely. It is unchanged. Your fear has deceived you. Holmes's voice cut across the room, quiet but edged like steel. And yet, Mr. Trevelyan, you know precisely where to look. Trevelyan started, his composure slipping for a moment. He turned, affecting surprise. Pardon, sir? Holmes rose now, crossing the carpet with deliberate steps. You approach the frame as a physician approaches a wound he has himself inflicted. You knew where the cut lay. The varnish you overlaid upon the portrait is delicate work. Ingenious, I grant you, but it betrays its author in the smallest signs. Trevelyan straightened, colour rising in his cheeks. You accuse me, on what grounds? On grounds of observation. Holmes drew from his pocket one of the negatives seized in St. John's lodging. This plate, scraped and varnished by a steady hand, is of your manufacture. The captain lacked such control. He was the passion, yes, but you were the calculation. Together you conspired. He supplied motive, you the means. Trevelyan's eyes darted to Sir Alistair, whose face had grown rigid with disbelief and fury. You cannot credit this, Alistair. Holmes is but weaving fancies. Would I, your own blood, seek to undo your happiness? Holmes's gaze was merciless. You would, and you did. Your debts speak louder than kinship. By delaying or destroying this marriage, you hoped to restore your fortunes. You toyed with the one thing even a steadfast man cannot bear to doubt, his beloved's face. Trevelyan made a sudden movement as if to snatch the negative. But Holmes was quicker, stepping back with the grace of a duellist. At that instant, the door opened and Inspector Lestrade entered, having been summoned earlier by Holmes to arrive at the proper moment. Two constables followed. Mr. Edwin Trevelyan, Holmes said coolly, you may explain your varnishes and negatives at Scotland Yard. I dare say they will admire your skill as much as I do, though their admiration may take the form of iron bars. For a moment Trevelyan's poise deserted him. He looked from Holmes to Sir Alistair, then to the portrait whose silent witness condemned him. He drew a breath as if to protest further, but the words withered. With a gesture half defiant, half weary, he surrendered his hands to the constables. As they led him out, Sir Alistair sank into a chair, his strength spent. Holmes returned to the mantel and lifted the photograph. The varnish, faintly visible under the altered light, gave the surface a ghostly sheen. With a fingernail he lifted the edge, and the thin film peeled away, revealing Clara Harbury's likeness, untouched and serene. You see, Sir Alistair, he said gently, the lady herself was never altered. Only your faith was tested. The trick was cruel, but its cruelty lies in the weakness it sought to exploit. Guard your trust, and no varnish will ever cloud it again. Sir Alistair pressed Holmes's hand in gratitude, unable to find words. Holmes merely inclined his head, as though the matter were already finished in his mind. As we left the house, the fog had lifted, and a pale moon traced the street with silver. Holmes drew upon his pipe, the smoke curling into the night. It is a curious world, Watson, he mused. Men will tamper with light itself to darken another's heart. Yet no deceit endures the steady gaze of truth. Come, we have earned a quiet evening, and perhaps I may coax a less melancholy tune from the violin. Thus the photograph ceased its hourly transformations, and with it ended a scheme that might have wrecked 2 lives. But I confess, as I followed Holmes into the lamplit mist, that I could not quite rid myself of the unease that lingers when shadows prove so easily persuaded to masquerade as truth. Holmes was unusually silent on the return to Baker Street. The moonlight made a pale road across the cab's roof, and the rattle of the wheels echoed in my ears like the last notes of a march ending too abruptly. I had expected him to exhibit that peculiar exhilaration he often displayed when a case reached its conclusion. But instead he leaned forward with his elbows upon his knees, staring at the space between his hands as though it contained a cipher not yet solved. At last he spoke, his voice low. "There is something unsatisfactory in this, Watson." I was startled. "Surely the case is closed. Trevelyan's guilt is beyond dispute. The negatives, the varnish, the very stratagem. Scotland Yard will see to the rest." Holmes gave a short, dry laugh. "Scotland Yard will see to a man. I am concerned with a scheme. The one does not necessarily encompass the other." I protested that the motive was clear. Debts, envy, perhaps the desire to unseat Sir Alistair from his engagement. What else could be required? Holmes shook his head. "Consider the precision, the timing. Our client's torment began not months ago, but 3 nights past. Why then? Why, after the engagement was long established and St. John already discarded, did the image begin its hourly masquerade? No, Watson. Trevelyan had the skill and St. John the motive, but the hand that pulled the strings may yet remain unseen." His words troubled me, for Holmes did not often doubt his own net when it had been cast. Yet I had seen the proof as plainly as he. We arrived at Baker Street, and Holmes immediately lit the lamp upon his desk, laying out the negatives once more, as though the mere act of staring at them would force them to yield a new confession. I poured us each a brandy, which he accepted absent-mindedly, his gaze never leaving the plates. "Do you observe, Watson," he said at last, "that one of these negatives bears no sign of Trevelyan's filing? It is untouched, yet different from the others. Here, look. Clara Harbury's face, but set against a curtain not of Vetch's studio. That background belongs to another place. I examined it under the lens and saw indeed what he meant. The drapery was heavier, patterned, unlike the plain curtain in the other likenesses. I asked him what it signified. "It signifies," Holmes replied, "that another photographer supplied this plate. Vetch had his boasts, Trevelyan his varnish, St. John his spite. But there is a fourth. Someone who placed into Trevelyan's hand the material that gave his scheme its perfection." Before I could question further, there came a knock at our door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face anxious. "A note for you, Mr. Holmes." The boy would not give his name. Holmes tore it open. I watched the lines settle into his features as he read, a tightening of the eyes, the faintest curl of the mouth. He passed it to me without comment. It was scrawled in a cramped, deliberate hand. "You think the game ended, but the hour is not yet struck. The lady's face will change again, though Trevelyan sleeps behind bars. Watch the mantle at midnight. A friend of shadows." The brandy turned hot in my throat. "Holmes, this is impossible. Trevelyan is in custody. How could the trick continue?" Holmes set his glass aside. "That, Watson, is the very question we must answer." He fetched his violin case from the corner, not for music, but for the slim tools he kept within it. "Tonight we shall return to Bentinck Street. Midnight will show us whether we hunt merely one man's vanity or a conspiracy more elaborate." Thus, a few minutes before 11, we once again climbed Sir Alistair's steps. He looked worn, though grateful, and when Holmes showed him the note, his features blanched. "You mean to say," he whispered, "that the torment is not ended?" Holmes assured him that it would end tonight, for either the deception would prove powerless without its architect, or we should catch the true architect in the act. He ordered all servants, locked away from the upper floor, and Sir Alistair himself remained with us, though trembling, in the drawing-room. Holmes set his lantern so the mantle was in full view. He took out a thin thread and affixed it delicately across the frame's back, so fine it would break at the slightest tampering. We waited. The house lay heavy with silence, broken only by the hall clock. Each quarter that chimed seemed louder than the last. At 5 minutes to midnight, Holmes motioned us closer. Sir Alistair's breath came fast, and I confess my own nerves were unsteady. Then the clock struck 12. At that instant, a soft creak sounded from beyond the wall, as if a panel shifted in its place. Holmes's eyes flashed. He snatched up the lantern and swept the light along the cornice. A faint draught stirred the curtains, and suddenly a section of the wainscot swung inward. A shadowed figure was there, half revealed in the beam. A woman, her features pale but resolute, holding a small bottle of varnish and a brush as delicate as a surgeon's scalpel. Holmes stepped forward, his voice like iron. "Miss Ada Lenfield, I believe, companion to Miss Harbury and companion too to deceit." The woman's hand trembled, but she did not retreat. "You should not have come," she said coldly. "It was too perfect." He would have doubted broken the betrothal. She would have been free. Free. For whom? Holmes demanded. For Trevelyan? For St. John? Or for yourself? Her gaze flickered, and in that moment the answer was plain. "Not for gain, Watson," Holmes murmured, "but for passion." She loved where she had no right to love. Miss Lenfield pressed back against the hidden panel, the bottle clutched to her breast. Her voice rose, filled with a bitter anguish. "Clara should not marry him. She does not see his ambition, his coldness. I only wished to save her, to make him falter before it was too late." Sir Alistair, stricken, could not speak. Holmes advanced another step, gentle yet implacable. "And so you painted upon her image the doubts you wished him to feel. Not his eyes, but yours, Miss Lenfield, saw Clara change each hour. It was your hand behind the shadows all along." Her strength failed then. The bottle slipped from her grasp and shattered upon the floor, releasing its sharp odor. The thin thread on the frame hung broken, proof of her interference. She covered her face with her hands. Holmes motioned me to guide Sir Alistair from the room. His last words, spoken low to me as we descended the stairs, carried the chill of final certainty. "The hour has struck indeed, Watson, but its chime speaks not of treachery alone. It tolls for the dangers of a heart that cannot master itself. And such dangers, I fear, no deduction can ever wholly prevent." We remained in the drawing-room long after the woman had been led away under Lestrade's charge. The shattered varnish bottle still lay in glittering fragments upon the carpet, filling the air with its acrid perfume. Sir Alistair stood by the mantel, staring at the photograph as though it might spring to life and reproach him. He seemed unable to comprehend that the serene likeness of his fiancée, so cruelly perverted night after night, had been nothing more than a stage upon which jealous hearts had acted their play. Holmes busied himself with the smallest of details, collecting the shards of glass with a handkerchief, examining the recess in the wall through which Miss Lenfield had emerged, and finally returning to the portrait itself. He peeled away the last layer of film, exposing the true surface once more, immaculate and unchanged. When he replaced it upon the mantel, it was with the air of a man restoring order to a universe that had momentarily forgotten its own laws. Sir Alistair turned to us at last, his voice hoarse. "I owe you more than gratitude, Mr. Holmes. I owe you sanity itself. To think that I might have doubted Clara, even for an instant." He broke off, pressing his brow with his hand. Holmes regarded him without softness, though not without understanding. "It is the oldest of weapons, Sir Alistair, the sowing of doubt. Strong men have fallen before it, not from lack of love, but from too much of it. Be thankful the blade was turned aside before it cut deeper." We left him then, with instructions to secure the hidden panel and keep the photograph sealed from curious eyes. As we stepped into the midnight street, the fog was lifting, and the stars had begun to pierce through like needles through gauze. I felt an immense weariness descend upon me. The case, so tangled with malice and ingenuity, seemed at last to have reached its terminus. Yet Holmes's stride remained quick, and his eyes still held the glint of pursuit. "You're not satisfied," I said quietly. He did not answer at once. When he did, it was in the measured tone he used when addressing not me, but the problem itself. "Trevelyan sought gain, St. John sought revenge. Miss Lenfield sought love twisted into obsession. Each played their part, yet none alone could have contrived the whole. They converged upon the same stage, but who wrote the script?" I reminded him of the anonymous note we had received, the one that summoned us back at midnight. Surely that had been her hand. Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. Lenfield acted out of passion, not calculation. She would not have risked discovery by summoning me. That was another player, one who preferred to remain in shadow, guiding each piece into place." The suggestion chilled me. "Do you mean there is yet another conspirator?" Holmes's mouth curved faintly, though there was no humor in it. "It is a curious thing, my dear fellow. When one flame is quenched, another often reveals itself behind the smoke. The following morning, before I had even finished my tea, Holmes was already at his desk with a pile of papers spread before him. They were reports from Lestrade, hastily delivered by a constable. Trevelyan had confessed to his role, naming St. John as his partner. St. John in turn had admitted to supplying negatives, though he insisted the refinements were beyond him, and Miss Lenfield, distraught but candid, declared she had indeed tampered with the photograph from within the concealed panel, but only after being persuaded that Penrith's affections were waning. Holmes tapped the last report with his long finger. "Persuaded, Watson, that is the word that sings louder than the rest." Someone whispered to each of them, playing upon their weaknesses, to Trevelyan, his debts, to St. John, his rejection, to Lenfield, her hopeless love. Each was given a thread to pull, never realizing the tapestry was woven by another hand. I frowned. But to what end? That is the question that still evades us. Holmes rose, pacing the room. Whoever it was, they had no need to soil their fingers with varnish or glass. Their pleasure lay in orchestration, watching others dance to their tune while remaining invisible. And mark me, Watson, they are still at liberty. He stopped at the window, his silhouette cut sharp against the grey morning. For a moment he stood motionless, then said with sudden intensity, "We must see Miss Harbury. I confess I was startled. But surely she is the one untouched by all this mischief." "Just so, and that is precisely why she is the keystone. In whose company does she walk? Who whispers in her ear? If the true hand is hidden, it may be closest of all." By noon we had arrived at Eaton Place. Miss Clara Harbury received us in a modest drawing-room, her manner grave but gracious. She was a young woman of quiet dignity, her bearing betraying the discipline of one raised in a military household. She welcomed Sir Alister's friends, though I thought I detected a shadow of unease in her eyes as Holmes bent over her hand. He wasted no time in politeness. "Madam, you have been the centre of a storm, though through no fault of your own. I must ask you plainly, has anyone save your aunt and companion spoken to you of Sir Alister's doubts?" She looked surprised. "Only Mr. Edwin, my cousin. He hinted once that Alister's heart was divided by his duties at Whitehall." I laughed it off, for I know Alister's constancy. "Why do you ask?" Holmes exchanged a glance with me before continuing. "And did he ever mention your portrait? Say that it troubled him?" Her brows knit. "Indeed, yes. He remarked upon it with a curious smile one afternoon, saying that it flattered me beyond truth. I thought it merely jest." Holmes's expression hardened, though he quickly masked it. "And your aunt, Mrs. Trevelyan, has she had cause to object to your engagement?" Miss Harbury hesitated. "My aunt is fond of me, yet she has often said that a life at Whitehall is ill-suited to a gentlewoman's peace. She favoured Edwin's company, it is true." Holmes inclined his head, and when we took our leave a few minutes later, his manner was as crisp as the winter air. As soon as the door closed behind us, he said under his breath, "It is as I feared." The play was staged not for Sir Alister nor for Clara, but for the aunt who watched from the wings. I stared at him. "Do you mean Mrs. Trevelyan?" Holmes drew his coat tight, his eyes alight with that fire I had come to know too well. "Mark my words, Watson. The hour is not finished. It is she who wound the clock. And unless we move swiftly, the chime we hear next may not be of varnish and shadows, but of ruin far more permanent." Holmes walked with such vigour down Eaton Place that I was forced into near military pace to keep by his side. The winter air stung, yet it seemed to sharpen his faculties, and I could feel his mind moving ahead of us as though already arranging the final pieces of a puzzle. He spoke suddenly, his voice clipped. "You saw her, Watson, Clara Harbury's aunt. A woman outwardly serene, but with the faint rigidity of one who guards a secret. The cousin's debts, the captain's wounded vanity, the companion's hopeless love, each was but a chord struck by her hand. But what would she gain?" I asked. "Surely the marriage of her niece to Sir Alister would secure comfort and position." Holmes shook his head. "On the contrary, it would remove Clara from her guardianship. Mrs. Trevelyan has grown accustomed to her influence, perhaps even her income. With Edwin as suitor, the household remains intact. But with Penrith's engagement, Clara would leave Eaton Place and the aunt's dominion would crumble. It is the old story, Watson. Power clutched too long becomes a habit stronger than affection." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately dispatched a note to Lestrade, urging him to delay Trevelyan's formal indictment until further inquiries were made. Then he drew from his shelf a directory, ran a finger down its pages, and smiled grimly when he found the name. "Mrs. Trevelyan's solicitor," he muttered. "If we know her business, we know her leverage." The hours passed with Holmes in restless motion, scribbling notes, pacing, and once even descending to the street to question a messenger boy about the times certain letters had been delivered to Eaton Place. At dusk, he returned triumphant, waving a small slip of paper. The boy remembers carrying sealed packets from Mrs. Trevelyan to Trevelyan himself, and once to St. John. Money, Watson, bribes and instructions disguised as family concern. That is the string binding them all. Before I could answer, a knock sounded, and Sir Alistair himself entered. He looked worn but resolute. "I could not remain ignorant, Mr. Holmes. Tell me, has the danger passed, or does it still shadow Clara?" Holmes regarded him gravely. "The shadow remains, but its shape grows clearer. Your cousin was but a pawn. The true adversary is Mrs. Trevelyan, who sought to weaken your trust by orchestrating doubts through others." Sir Alistair paled, gripping the back of a chair. "My aunt? Impossible. She raised Clara since childhood." "Affection and authority are not twins," Holmes replied. "Some women prefer rule to love. But courage, Sir Alistair, you must be steady. The truth must be revealed, not only to you but to Clara, else the poison festers unseen." It was agreed that we should confront Mrs. Trevelyan that very evening. We set out together, and the cab wheels carried us swiftly once more to Eaton Place. Clara herself greeted us, surprised at our return, but yielded to Holmes's firm request that her aunt join us in the parlour. Mrs. Trevelyan entered with measured composure, her gown severe, her face calm to the point of chill. Holmes bowed slightly, then wasted no time. "Madam, I regret the intrusion, but I must speak plainly. Your household has been the stage for a cruel deception. The photograph that tormented Sir Alistair was altered not by chance, nor solely by the misguided acts of cousin, companion, or suitor. It was you who bound them all, feeding each the encouragement he or she required." Her eyes, grey and still, revealed nothing. "And on what authority, Mr. Holmes, do you slander a gentlewoman in her own house?" "On the authority of evidence." Holmes drew forth the slip of paper from the messenger boy. "These were your packets delivered in secret. Within them, no doubt, were promises to Edwin, urgings to St. John, hints to Ada Lenfield of waning affections. You whispered to each according to their weakness. And when doubt began to flower, you stood aside, the very image of propriety. While Penrith's trust withered, Clara had risen to her feet, her face white. "Aunt, can this be true?" For the first time, Mrs. Trevelyan's composure faltered. Her lips trembled, though she forced them into stillness. "He would take you from me, Clara. I could not bear it. 12 years I kept this house, guided you, guarded you. And for what? To be discarded by a stranger whose name happens to glitter at Whitehall." Sir Alistair stepped forward, his tone firm yet not unkind. "Madam, your care is acknowledged, but affection twisted into control becomes cruelty. To shatter Clara's happiness for the sake of your pride, can you not see the wrong?" She sank into a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her defiance ebbed, leaving only weariness. "Perhaps it was wrong. But I'm an old woman, and habit binds me stronger than chains." Holmes's voice softened, though it retained its precision. "Wrong, yes, but not irredeemable. Lestrade shall hear of your influence, and it may weigh against the harsher judgments upon the others. But your reign here is ended. Clara must be free, or the shadow you cast will darken every hour of her life." Tears welled suddenly in Clara's eyes, and she knelt beside her aunt, grasping her hand. "Oh, aunt, if you had but spoken, if you had trusted my love rather than feared it, none of this would have been needed." For a moment silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hiss of the gaslight. Holmes turned away, his face unreadable. Sir Alistair placed a protective arm about Clara's shoulders, and together they seemed to embody the future the aunt had tried so desperately to prevent. We left them then. Mrs. Trevelyan bowed, but not wholly broken, Clara radiant though shaken. In the cab, Holmes lit his pipe, the glow briefly illuminating his sharp features. "You see, Watson, how often the heart, untamed by reason, becomes the most dangerous adversary. Trevelyan, St. John, Lenfield, they were merely instruments. The true composer was a woman who could not part with what she thought her own. And is the case ended now?" I asked, Holmes exhaled a long plume of smoke. Ended indeed, perhaps, but the echo of such schemes lingers. Even now I wonder whether Clara will forgive as she hopes, or whether doubt, once sown, can ever wholly be uprooted. Such questions lie beyond deduction, my dear Watson, but they are often the ones that matter most. The cab carried us into the lamplight, the city settling into its nocturnal rhythm, while Holmes sat in silence, the smoke curling about him like the last shadow of a photograph that, once altered, could never be quite the same again. The following days passed with a quiet that seemed unnatural after the storm of revelations. London, indifferent as ever, bustled on with its trades and its fogs, yet within Baker Street there remained a lingering air of unfinished business. Holmes took no new case, nor did he return to his violin. Instead, he sat for long stretches in his chair, pipe in hand, staring at the coal fire as though its shifting embers concealed the true portrait of the affair. I sought to rouse him, reminding him that Trevelyan and St. John were now securely held, and that Miss Lenfield, while guilty of weakness, would likely meet with leniency, thanks to her confession. Mrs. Trevelyan, too, had admitted her manipulations. What more could be asked? Holmes replied with the faintest shake of his head. A play may conclude, Watson, yet still we feel the draught from behind the curtain. It is not the crime itself that lingers in my mind, but the ease with which 3 souls, 4 if we count the aunt, were led into harmony, each striking their note of deception as if following an unseen conductor. That, my friend, troubles me more than the varnish or the negatives. I was about to press him further when Mrs. Hudson brought in a visitor. To my surprise, it was Clara Harbury herself, dressed in sombre grey, her composure dignified yet shadowed by unease. She greeted Holmes with gratitude, but her voice trembled. "Mr. Holmes, I owe you my thanks for restoring Alistair's faith and my own peace. Yet I come not for gratitude but counsel. My aunt has withdrawn into herself since that evening. She speaks little, but her silence weighs heavily upon the house. Edwin is disgraced, Roland St. John ruined, Ada Lenfield in custody, all bound by schemes that touched me, though I knew nothing of them. Tell me, how am I to proceed? Can happiness rise from such ruin?" Holmes regarded her with a gentleness rare in him. "Madam, happiness, like truth, is not free from shadows. You must tread with patience. Trust is not rebuilt in a day, but it is the stronger for having been tested. As for your aunt, compassion may soften her bitterness more than reproach ever could." She inclined her head, visibly moved, and departed soon after, leaving the faint scent of violets in the air. Holmes remained silent for a long moment before turning to me. "You see, Watson, how the case refuses to end. It began with a photograph, but its true subject was not the likeness of a young lady. It was the fragility of faith, the peril of hearts governed by secrecy." Later that evening, Lestrade himself called. He brought news that confirmed Holmes's foresight. Trevelyan had confessed fully under examination, admitting that it was his aunt who encouraged him with promises of inheritance should Clara's marriage fail. St. John, too, under the weight of evidence, had admitted to supplying his bitterness as weapon, while Lenfield, poor creature, had yielded to persuasion under the impression that she was saving her friend from misery. "It is an ugly tangle," Lestrade said, shaking his head, "and all of it spun round a lady who never lifted a finger herself. What will the law do with Mrs. Trevelyan? That remains uncertain. There are no statutes against whispering poison into willing ears." Holmes only smiled thinly. "The law may not reach her, but conscience will. And that punishment, Inspector, is often the most inexorable." When Lestrade had gone, the fire burned low, and I found myself reflecting aloud. "You have solved many mysteries, Holmes, but seldom one that touched so near to the heart. Was it not strange that so many people could be bent toward one design by nothing more than an elderly woman's desire for control?" Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Strange, no, Watson. It is the most common of patterns. Men will act for gold, women for love, and the old for fear of being forgotten. Each of these motives is as combustible as lamp oil. Mrs. Trevelyan merely struck the match. I thought then of Sir Alistair, of Clara, of the doubts planted in a heart that had seemed so steadfast. Could such wounds truly heal? Holmes, perceiving my thoughts, answered them, though I had not spoken. "You wonder whether Penrith will ever look upon Clara's likeness without recalling the deception. I tell you he will. But not because the image is constant, because she herself is. Time, Watson, is the only varnish that cannot be peeled away. The case gradually receded into the stream of memory, yet even now, writing these lines, I recall the uncanny sensation of watching that portrait shift and shimmer under the gaslight. It was as though the very fabric of trust had been set trembling, reminding us that certainty is never as solid as it appears. On the final night before we turned again to new matters, Holmes stood at the window gazing out at the city, its roofs gleaming damp beneath the moon. He spoke as if to himself, though I heard every word. Men think the photograph a truth fixed forever, yet even glass and varnish may be bent to falsehood. So it is with the heart, Watson. Yet just as light, properly directed, reveals the truth upon a plate, so too may reason dispel the darkest illusions. He turned then, his eyes bright with that peculiar mixture of weariness and triumph that marked the end of a battle well fought. Enough of shadows. Tomorrow we shall see what new folly London has contrived for us. And with that he retired, leaving me alone with the fire, pondering how a mere likeness could so nearly undo a bond of flesh and spirit. The photograph no longer changed each hour, but the lesson it left behind lingered, clear as any print upon glass, that trust once clouded must be guarded as jealously as life itself. The days that followed brought a certain quietude, as though the city itself had drawn a curtain on the affair. The papers made mention of a curious case of photographic fraud, but the reports were vague, for neither Lestrade nor Holmes had any wish to expose the full sordid web to public gaze. Trevelyan and St. John would face their punishments. Lenfield was released into the care of her family with little more than a caution, and Mrs. Trevelyan withdrew into her own household, where I am told she seldom ventured beyond her rooms. Thus the actors in the drama faded one by one from view, leaving only Clara Harbury and Sir Alister to rebuild what jealousy had sought to shatter. I visited them some weeks later at their residence, once they were married. The photograph, now stripped of its layers of deceit, held pride of place upon their mantle. I confess I looked at it long and hard, half expecting some shadow to stir, some brooch to vanish or reappear. But it remained unchanged, as steady as the woman herself who smiled from its frame. Sir Alister, his confidence renewed, thanked Holmes in words far stronger than his reserved temperament usually permitted. Clara, with quiet grace, said only that their lives together would be proof against any varnish or false light. Back at Baker Street, I remarked upon the completeness of the resolution. Surely, Holmes, the matter is ended. He gave a small sardonic smile. Ended indeed, Watson, though not in lesson. Remember, the photograph did not change of its own will. Men and women altered it, each bending truth to their desire. That is the essence of so many of our cases. The world believes in permanence, in portraits, in promises, in institutions. Yet all are but plates, upon which ambition and fear may write what they please. Our task is only to strip away the film and reveal what lies beneath. He rose then, reaching for his violin, and drew from it a strain not of melancholy but of measured triumph. The notes filled the room, clear and resolute, as if to remind me that while shadows may shift and faces may alter under deceitful hands, truth itself requires no embellishment, and so the case of the photograph that changed each hour was consigned to my chronicles. It left me with an impression not only of Holmes's brilliance, but of the fragile nature of trust, that most human of treasures. For if a likeness can be tampered with so cunningly, what then of the heart that gazes upon it? Yet I also learned this, that beneath varnish and alteration, beneath doubt and deceit, the truth remains waiting, unchanged, unchanging, until a steady eye, sharpened by reason, brings it once more into the light. Holmes, seeing me deep in thought, lowered his bow with a final flourish, and remarked with that dry humour of his, "Come, Watson, let us leave photographs to their vanity. The city grows restless, and somewhere another shadow waits for the lantern." Thus the case closed, not with the hour striking doom, but with the calm certainty that as long as Sherlock Holmes stood watch over London's mysteries, no deception, whether born of passion, greed, or fear, could long escape the light of his relentless gaze.